The Haunted Doll Files Episode 1. Before you press play on this video, I need you to understand something. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is not a campfire story. It is not a legend passed down by grandmothers in candlelit rooms. It is a documented case, with names, with dates, with photographs, with testimonies from police officers, medical professionals, and paranormal researchers who, in their own words, had no rational explanation for what they witnessed. There is a doll. Her name, the name she was given, the name written on a faded tag tied to her wrist with a piece of red thread, is Mara. She is 31 centimeters tall. She has glass eyes the color of dirty river water. Her hair is real. The man who first documented her case in 1987 wrote in his notes, "The hair is human. We had it tested. We don't know whose it is." Mara has passed through 11 families across 4 countries in the last 67 years. Of those 11 families, 9 experienced what can only be described as catastrophic loss within 18 months of acquiring her. 2 families are unaccounted for. This is how it begins. There is a moment, investigators call it the threshold moment, when a person first holds Mara. They describe a sensation that is difficult to articulate. Not cold, exactly, not the clammy chill you might expect from an old ceramic doll stored in a damp attic. What they describe is closer to warmth, an unsettling, specific warmth, the kind a stone gives off after sitting in afternoon sunlight. The kind that tells you something was just here, something that has only recently left. Paranormal researcher Daniel Harwick held Mara for approximately 40 seconds during his 2003 investigation in Lancashire, England. In the audio recording of that session, a recording that has since been reviewed by multiple independent analysts, you can hear him say, very quietly, almost under his breath, "It feels like holding a sleeping child." He said nothing else for 11 minutes. When asked afterward what he had been thinking during those 11 minutes, Harwick took a long time to answer. He looked at the recorder on the table between them. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "I was thinking that whatever is inside that thing is very old. And very patient, and it has been waiting a long time." Daniel Harwick died 8 months later. His death was ruled accidental, a fall down a staircase in his home. His wife told the coroner that the light on the staircase had been replaced only 2 weeks prior. That the bulb was found intact at the bottom of the stairs, beside his body. Unscrewed, not broken, simply removed from its socket and placed carefully on the floor. No one in the house admitted to removing it. This is the story of Mara. This is where it starts. And this, I want to be very clear, is not where it ends. To understand what Mara is, you first need to understand where she came from. Or rather, you need to understand that no one truly knows where she came from. The earliest documented record of Mara's existence is a black and white photograph taken in September 1957 at a charity sale held by St. Bridget's Parish Hall in the town of Colford, Gloucestershire, England. The photograph was taken by a local newspaper journalist covering the event, a routine piece about community fundraising. The doll appears on a trestle table in the background of the image, partially obscured by a woman in a floral dress who is holding up a ceramic jug for inspection. For decades, no one noticed Mara in that photograph. It was not until 1999, when a retired schoolteacher named Patricia Holt began digitizing her late mother's collection of local newspaper clippings, that the doll was identified. Patricia recognized Mara immediately, because by that point, Patricia had already lived with Mara for 11 years. She had tried to get rid of Mara twice. Both times, the doll had come back. We will get to Patricia's story. But first, the doll itself. Mara is a porcelain-headed doll of a type manufactured in France and Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her body is cloth, cotton over a sawdust and horsehair stuffing that is consistent with dolls produced in the 1890s to 1920s. Her head and hands are glazed bisque porcelain, unpainted except for the lips, a faded red that several forensic analysts have noted does not match any commercial doll paint of the period. One analyst, contacted by researcher Angela Morse in 2011, described it simply as applied after manufacture, with a substance I could not identify with certainty. Her eyes are glass, pale gray-green, set deep in the porcelain head, fixed pupils, as was standard for the period. And yet, every single person who has documented extended time with Mara has noted the same thing, independent of each other, across decades of testimony. The eyes move, not dramatically, not in the way you see in horror films, the slow mechanical rotation of glass irises. What people describe is subtler, a shift, A change in where the eyes appear to be directed. You leave a room with Mara facing the window. You return and she is facing the door. You tell yourself you imagined it. You tell yourself you simply misremembered. You tell yourself this for as long as you can. The hair is where it becomes undeniable. Mara's hair is dark brown, fine textured, falling to just below her porcelain collar. It is styled in the fashion of a girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years old, parted at the center, swept back from her face. It is not synthetic, it is not horsehair. 3 independent laboratory analyses, conducted in 1989, 2003, and 2014, have confirmed that the hair is human. The DNA results from the 2014 analysis were submitted to the National DNA Database. No match was found. The origin of Mara, who made her, for whom, and why she was at a charity sale in Colford in 1957, remains entirely unknown. No manufacturer's mark has ever been found on her body. The bisque composition of her head suggests a French or possibly Austrian origin, but no catalog from any known manufacturer of the period matches her exactly. She is, in the words of antique doll specialist Rowena Blackwell, who examined her in 2009, unlike anything I have seen in 40 years of this work. There is something about her construction that suggests whoever made her was not making a toy. She was bought at that 1957 charity sale for 1 shilling and 6 pence. The woman who bought her was named Edna Calloway. She was 43 years old, a widow, and she had gone to the sale looking for a christening gift for her daughter's newborn. She brought Mara home instead. Her daughter never received a christening gift. Within 6 weeks of the purchase, Edna Calloway was admitted to Gloucester Royal Hospital with what her medical records describe as acute onset psychological disturbance, characterized by visual hallucinations and severe sleep disorder. She remained there for 4 months. When she was discharged, she went home to find that her daughter had, in the interim, given the doll to a neighbor's child. That child's name was William Astor. He was 7 years old. He was the second owner. And his family's story is where things begin to get strange. The Astor family in 1957 were, by all accounts, an unremarkable household on Birch Lane in Colford. Thomas Astor worked at the paper mill. His wife, Margaret, kept the house and raised their 4 children, William, age 7, Susan, age 10, Robert, age 13, and the baby of the family, infant Catherine, born that spring. William brought Mara home on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Margaret Astor's reaction to the doll, according to her own written account, a journal she kept sporadically throughout her life, portions of which were shared with researcher Angela Morse by Margaret's surviving daughter Susan in 2008, was immediate and visceral. I did not like it from the moment Willie carried it through the door. There is no sensible reason I can give. It is a doll, a rather old and tired-looking doll with glassy eyes and real hair that I do not wish to think too much about. But I told Willie to keep it in his room and not bring it to the table. He looked at me as though I had said something peculiar. He said, "Mum, her name is Mara." I asked him how he knew that. He said, "She told me." Margaret's journal entry for that evening ends there. There is a gap of 3 days before the next entry. In it, she writes about the weather and a visit from her sister. She does not mention Mara, but she returns to the subject 1 week later. The doll has been moved again. I put her in the corner of Willie's room, facing the wall, because I find I cannot be comfortable with those eyes. This morning I went in to wake him and she was on the windowsill, facing out into the garden. Willie says he did not move her. He says he was asleep. He is 7 years old. I believe him. This would be the first of many such entries over the following months. The movement of Mara was the earliest and most persistent phenomenon reported by the Astor family. It began subtly, a repositioning overnight, a rotation toward whatever door someone was about to enter. Margaret documented it methodically, in the way of a woman who prided herself on rational thinking and found the rationalism increasingly strained. Tuesday. Placed facing window at 9 p.m. Found facing door at 7 a.m. Willie asleep throughout. Robert confirms, they share a room. Friday. Placed on top of wardrobe, lying flat. Found upright on floor beside bed. No explanation. Sunday. I removed her from the room entirely and placed her in the hall cupboard. She was back in Willie's room by morning. I do not know how. The second phenomenon was the temperature. Several times throughout that winter, Margaret noted cold spots in William's room that she could not account for, a localized, specific chill that seemed to move, that would be present near the window at 1 hour and near the wardrobe the next. She assumed initially it was a draft, Old houses in Colford were not well insulated, and the winter of 1957-58 was particularly bitter. But she noted that the cold did not correlate with the direction of wind, nor with any obvious gap in the walls or floor. "It is as though something cold is walking around the room," she wrote on the 14th of December, 1957. "I know how that sounds. I am not a superstitious woman. I am writing it down because I do not want to forget what I observed." The third phenomenon was more difficult to dismiss. In January 1958, the Astor family's infant daughter Catherine, 3 months old, began exhibiting what Margaret described as unusual behavior during the nights. She would wake not crying but laughing. A full, clear laugh, the kind no mother expects from a 3-month-old infant. The sound would last for several minutes and then stop. Margaret would go to the crib to find the baby awake, staring fixedly at a point above the crib, her expression one of intense, focused concentration. The crib was in the master bedroom, not in William's room, not near Mara, but Margaret noted 3 times that on the mornings following these episodes, Mara would be found in a different position than the one she had been left in the night before. On one occasion, she was found not in William's room at all. She was found on the floor at the foot of Catherine's crib. No one admitted to moving her. Thomas Astor's response to all of this was, predictably, skeptical. He was a practical man. He had explanations for each incident. The children were moving the doll as a game. The cold was a draft. The baby's laughing was something babies sometimes did. He had an explanation for everything except, as Margaret wrote, the look on his face when he thinks no one is watching him. He is afraid of it. He won't say so, but I can see it. Then came the photographs. In February 1958, a family friend took several photographs at Catherine's christening, held at St. Bridget's, the same church, the same parish hall where Mara had first appeared at the charity sale 4 months earlier. The photographs were developed a week later. Standard domestic snapshots. The family gathered around the font, Catherine in her white christening gown, the older children scrubbed and uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes. In one photograph, taken inside the hall during the reception after the service, Mara appears on a shelf in the background. No one had brought her. Margaret's account of seeing that photograph is one of the most quoted passages in the documented history of Mara's case. "I looked at it for a very long time. Then I put it face down on the table. Then I went into Willie's room. She was there, on the windowsill, exactly as I had left her that morning. So she could not have been at the hall, except she was in the photograph. And I know that shelf. I know it, and there is no doll that looks like that in St. Bridget's Hall. There never has been." Margaret showed the photograph to the family friend who had taken it. He had no explanation. He had not noticed anything unusual at the christening. Margaret kept the photograph in an envelope at the back of her wardrobe for the rest of her life. When her daughter Susan found it after Margaret's death in 1994, the shelf in the background was clearly visible. The shelf was empty. Mara was not in the photograph. She had been removed from it, or she had never been there at all, and 40 years of Margaret Astor's certainty had been, in some way that defies easy explanation, simply wrong. The Astor family lived with Mara for 3 years. In that time, the phenomena escalated, not dramatically, not in a single cataclysmic event, but in the slow, grinding, cumulative way that investigators who work with objects like Mara describe as the most characteristic feature of her case. It wears people down. It does not terrify, not at first. It exhausts. It erodes certainty. It makes the ordinary feel threatening and the threatening feel ordinary. By 1959, every member of the Astor family had experienced something they could not explain. Robert, the eldest son, was the most resistant. He was 15 by now, approaching manhood, and he regarded his mother's documented distress about the doll with the elaborate contempt of an adolescent who considers himself far too sophisticated for such foolishness. He told his friends, in the way teenagers do, that his mum had gone a bit funny about an old toy. He laughed about it. He stopped laughing in March of 1959. He could not say exactly when the dreams started. Looking back, he thought perhaps they had been going on for some weeks before he identified them as unusual. They were not nightmares, not in the classical sense. He did not wake screaming. He did not dream of monsters or violence or the standard catalog of adolescent fear. He dreamed of a room. Just a room. A small room with low ceilings and bare wooden walls and a single window through which a gray light fell, flat and directionless, the light of neither day nor night. And in the room, sitting on the floor with her back to him, was a girl. The girl never turned around. She never spoke. She sat very still and Robert would stand in the doorway. He was always in the doorway, never able to enter the room, and watch her, and feel a terrible, wordless dread that he could not source, that had no object, that simply was. Then he would wake up. He told no one about the dreams. He was 15, he would not, but in April 1959, the month he turned 16, he came downstairs at 2 in the morning for a glass of water and found Mara sitting on the kitchen table. He had not put her there. No one had put her there. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas and stared at her, and she sat on the table with her glass eyes directed, as far as he could tell, straight at him. And Robert Astor, who was almost 16 years old and did not believe in anything he could not explain, turned around and went back to bed and did not mention it to anyone for 43 years. He told the story to Angela Morse in 2002, at the age of 59. His voice on the recording is flat and steady, the voice of a man who has spent decades making peace with something. I went back to bed, he said, and I pulled the covers up, and I thought, it's just a doll. It's just a doll on a table in the kitchen. Someone put it there, and I lay there in the dark and I thought that for a long time. And somewhere in the middle of thinking it, I realized that I could hear something. Morse asked what he had heard. There was a pause. Breathing, he said, from across the hall, from Willie's room, but Willie wasn't there. He was at our Nan's for the week. The room was empty, and there was breathing in it. He did not go and look. He stayed in his bed with the covers pulled up until morning. He never touched Mara. In 3 years of living in that house, he never once touched the doll. Susan Astor, 4 years younger than Robert, had a different experience. Where Robert met the phenomena with denial and distance, Susan was drawn to Mara with a compulsion she could not articulate. She was 10 years old when the doll arrived. She wanted, desperately, to play with her. Margaret refused. The doll was Willie's, and beyond that, there was something about her that Margaret would not permit near her daughter, though she could never put it into words that satisfied either Susan or herself. Susan found ways around the prohibition. Small, furtive visits to William's room when her mother was occupied. She would sit beside the doll and talk to her. She was 10 years old. This was not unusual behavior. What was unusual was what she reported feeling. It was like she was listening, Susan told Angela Morse. Not the way a toy listens. Not pretend, actually listening. I would tell her things I hadn't told anyone, and it felt like she was taking them in. Keeping them. Morse asked if that had frightened her. Not then, Susan said. Then it felt like a secret between us. It only frightened me later. Much later, when I started to wonder what she was going to do with everything I'd told her. In the summer of 1959, the phenomena entered a new phase. William Astor, now 9 years old, began sleepwalking. He had never done so before. Margaret's journal records the first incident in June. She was woken at 3:30 in the morning by a sound from downstairs and found William standing in the garden, in his nightclothes, in the rain, staring at a point in the far corner of the garden where an old apple tree stood. He was not distressed. He was not crying. His eyes were open. When she touched his shoulder, he turned to look at her with an expression she described as absent, like looking at a stranger through a window. She guided him back to bed. He did not remember it in the morning. This happened 11 times over the following 8 months. Always between 3 and 4 in the morning. Always in the garden. Always facing the apple tree. On several occasions, Margaret checked his room before going to him and found Mara had been moved, placed on the floor beside his empty bed, or on his pillow, or once, inexplicably, balanced upright on his windowsill with her face pressed against the glass, facing into the dark garden below. Margaret began sleeping lightly. She began waking at the slightest sound. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. She lost weight. Her journal entries grew shorter, more erratic, sometimes stopping mid-sentence. Thomas Astor, still unwilling to acknowledge anything beyond the ordinary, contacted their family doctor. William was examined and assessed as healthy. The sleepwalking was attributed to stress. The doctor noted that the boy had seemed anxious in the consultation, and that anxiety could manifest in sleep disturbance. He prescribed a mild sedative. The sleepwalking stopped, for 3 weeks. Then, on a Saturday night in November 1959, William Astor walked out into the garden at 3:45 in the morning, and this time, when Margaret found him, he was not standing under the apple tree. He was sitting cross-legged under it, in the frozen mud, and Mara was in his lap. He had never left the house without her before. He had never, to Margaret's knowledge, taken her into the garden. She stood at the kitchen door in the cold and she looked at her 9-year-old son sitting under the apple tree in the dark with that doll in his lap, and she said his name. He turned and looked at her. His eyes were open. He was smiling. She said to say hello, he said. Margaret Astor's journal entry for that night consists of 4 words. We must leave, now. Thomas Astor required another 3 months of persuasion. In February 1960, the family moved to Bristol. Margaret attempted to leave Mara behind. She placed her in the back of the hall cupboard, wrapped in a flour sack, and told no one where she had put her. 2 weeks after the move, Margaret was unpacking boxes in the Bristol house when she opened a crate of kitchen items and found Mara inside it, nestled between a teapot and a set of mixing bowls, wrapped in the same flour sack, tied with the same piece of string. She had not packed that crate herself. She sat on the kitchen floor and stared at the doll for a very long time. Then she closed the crate. She did not tell Thomas. Mara stayed with the family for another 8 months in Bristol. During that time, the activity continued, the movements, the cold, the dreams. And then, in October 1960, something happened that finally, definitively, ended the Astor family's involvement with Mara. But we will get to that. The story of the Astor family did not, at first, extend beyond the family. Margaret was not a woman who discussed her private life with neighbors. Thomas would have been mortified by the implication that his household was subject to anything he could not explain by rational means. The older children, Robert and Susan, had absorbed the family's habitual privacy. William, the youngest of the older 4, was quiet by nature. And Catherine, the baby, was too young to know anything was wrong, though she would later describe, much later, as a woman in her 50s speaking to Angela Morse on a rainy Tuesday in 2008. A childhood permeated by a feeling she had never been quite able to name. Like something watching, she said. Not threatening, exactly, or not only threatening, more like, observed, always observed, as though you could never be fully alone in a room, even when you were certain you were. She paused. I was 40 before I connected that feeling to the doll. I thought it was just how I was. I thought I was just a nervous person. She was quiet for a moment. When Angela showed me the photographs, I cried. I hadn't cried about it before. I didn't know there was anything to cry about. But in Bristol, in the winter of 1960, the story began to leak. It began with the neighbors. The Astor's house in Bristol was a terraced property on a quiet street in Redland. The kind of street where people minded their own business but also, through the simple physical proximity of terraced housing, could not entirely avoid knowing that business. The wall between the Astors and the Hendersons to their left was not thick. Dorothy Henderson, a woman of 53 who kept an immaculate house and had strong opinions about the importance of sleep, was therefore aware that something was occurring in the Astor household at night. She was not aware of Mara. She was aware of the sounds. She told her husband, and eventually, in the tentative and embarrassed way of people who very much do not want to be thought peculiar, her sister, and then her sister's friend, who told someone else, and by the time the story reached the ears of a reporter on the Bristol Evening Post, it had transformed in the way that all good stories transform with distance, grown larger, stranger, more dramatic. The reporter, a young man named Jeffrey Tanner who was hungry for copy and somewhat less scrupulous than he might have been, knocked on the Astor's door in December 1960. Thomas Astor, incandescent with rage at the implication, told him in no uncertain terms to leave. But the story was already moving. 2 weeks later, and this is the detail that investigators have returned to repeatedly, because its timing is almost impossible to attribute to coincidence, Margaret Astor told her sister what had been happening. The full account, Mara, the movements, the sleepwalking, the photograph from the christening, the night under the apple tree in Colford. Her sister, whose name was Vera, listened without interrupting. Then she said, Margaret, the woman up the road has a doll, and she told me things about it that I think you need to hear. The woman up the road was named Frances Doyle. She was 61 years old, a retired nurse, and she had a doll that her neighbor's granddaughter had given her the previous spring. A doll that the granddaughter had found at a car boot sale in Thornbury and brought home, only for her mother to demand she remove it from the house after a week. The doll had gray-green glass eyes and dark brown human hair and had been manufactured at some point in the late 19th century. Frances had named her Agnes. Margaret came to see it on a Thursday afternoon and stood in Frances Doyle's hallway and looked at the doll on the hall table and felt the floor shift slightly under her feet. It was not the same doll. She was certain of that. She had looked at Mara for 3 years. She knew Mara's face, the precise angle of her chin, the particular set of her glass eyes. This doll's features were slightly different, the mouth a fraction wider, the nose a different shape. They were clearly not the same object. And yet, they are alike, Margaret told her sister afterward, in the account that Vera recorded in a letter to her own daughter years later and which Angela Morse eventually obtained. Not identical, like sisters, like two things made by the same hand. Frances Doyle's experiences with her doll had begun immediately upon its arrival and were identical in pattern to everything Margaret had documented. The movements, the cold, the dreams, the persistent sense of being observed. Frances, being a retired nurse and therefore inclined toward documentation, had kept her own notes. She showed them to Margaret. They sat together at Frances's kitchen table and compared their records, two women in their 40s and 60s, going through their notebooks like accountants auditing figures, and finding that the columns matched perfectly. There was no explanation for why two similar dolls should be producing identical phenomena in two separate households 17 miles apart. But the detail that disturbed Margaret most, the detail she wrote about in her journal and returned to repeatedly in the years that followed, was something Frances said almost in passing, as they were putting on their coats to leave. "She has a name, you know," Frances said. "Agnes told me herself." Margaret, her coat half on, stopped. "Told you how?" Frances smiled, a little awkwardly. "In dreams. She comes to me in dreams. She's not frightening in them. She's just a little girl. She says her name is Mara." The room, Margaret wrote, felt very small and very cold. "Agnes," she said, "and Mara." Frances nodded. "I think there may be others," Frances said quietly. "I think there have always been others." The community impact of these two women's shared testimony was, initially, localized. A few more people told a few more stories. There was a woman in Clifton who had owned something similar, and a retired schoolteacher in Bedminster who remembered a doll that had passed through his family in the 1940s and which his mother had spoken of in hushed terms all her life. These accounts circulated at the level of neighborhood conversation, the informal sharing of unease that communities manage through talk. The reporter Jeffrey Tanner, still working the story, eventually interviewed Frances Doyle. His article, published in the Bristol Evening Post in January 1961, was small and mildly mocking in tone. The kind of piece that treats paranormal claims as charming eccentricity, good for a column inch or two on a slow news day. But it was read, and among the people who read it was a man in Lancashire named Walter Baines. Walter Baines wrote a letter to the paper. He wrote, a doll with gray-green glass eyes and human hair. He had acquired her in 1952. His letter ran to 4 pages. He had a great deal to say. He was the beginning of the wider investigation. But before we get to the investigators, we need to talk about what happened to the Astors in October 1960. Because that is when Mara showed them what she was truly capable of. The formal investigation of Mara, and of the network of similar dolls that would come to be referred to, in the informal taxonomy of paranormal researchers, as the Mara series, began in 1963 with a man named Arthur Peel. Arthur Peel was 52 years old, a former lecturer in psychology at the University of Bristol who had spent the last decade pursuing what he called, with characteristic understatement, cases of sustained anomalous phenomena in domestic environments. He had investigated poltergeist reports, cases of spontaneous combustion, premonition clusters, and one deeply peculiar case in Somerset involving a piano that played the same sequence of notes every night at midnight for 6 years before the house burned down. He was not a credulous man. He was, by the accounts of those who worked with him, almost pathologically skeptical, a man who had spent his career developing the tools to detect fraud, self-delusion, and hoax, and who applied those tools with equal vigor whether he liked the conclusions they produced or not. He heard about the Bristol doll stories from Jeffrey Tanner, who by 1963 had moved to a larger paper and still had his notes from the original article. He heard about Walter Baines's letter. He drove to Bristol and interviewed Frances Doyle, who was by then 71, physically frail, and in possession of 17 notebooks full of careful documentation of everything Agnes had done since 1960. He drove to Lancashire and interviewed Walter Baines. He traced Margaret Astor, who had, by 1963, left Thomas and was living in Exeter with her children, and conducted 3 lengthy interviews with her. And then he submitted a formal research proposal to the Society for Psychical Research, requesting funding to investigate what he described as a repeating pattern of anomalous phenomena associated with a specific category of antique doll, occurring across multiple households in a geographically dispersed area, with consistent phenomenological signatures that suggest either a shared cultural narrative of unusual persistence or a genuinely novel class of physical or psychological phenomenon. The society funded the proposal. Over the following 3 years, Peel identified and documented 9 cases of dolls matching Mara's description, and documented household experiences matching her behavior pattern. The 9 cases were spread across England and Scotland, with one outlier in Northern Ireland. They spanned a period from 1932 to 1963. The earliest case he could document was a family in Aberdeen who had acquired a doll at an estate sale in 1932 and lived with increasing terror until they moved house in 1935 and deliberately left it behind. The doll had reappeared at their new address within a month. Peel's methodology was meticulous. For each case, he interviewed surviving witnesses, obtained any physical documentation, photographs, letters, medical records, and attempted to physically examine the doll involved. In 5 of the 9 cases, the doll was still in the possession of the family or their descendants. In 3 cases, the doll had been passed on and its subsequent location was unknown. In one case, the doll had been destroyed, or rather, had apparently been destroyed, and had subsequently been found intact. But we will come to that. The dolls he examined presented consistent physical characteristics. Late 19th century or early 20th century French or German bisque manufacture, cloth body, human hair, glass eyes of that distinctive gray-green color. All were in remarkably good condition for their age. Peel noted, in each case, that the dolls appeared to age at a significantly slower rate than comparable objects from the same period. One doll, which should by rights have been between 60 and 80 years old, looked, by Peel's assessment, as though it might have been manufactured within the last 10 years. He had the hair from 4 of the 9 dolls independently tested. All 4 samples were confirmed as human. The DNA technology of the 1960s was, of course, primitive by modern standards. Individual identification was not possible. But the tests confirmed the hair was human, and further analysis confirmed it was consistent with that of a child, based on the diameter and growth characteristics of the follicles. The same child, across 4 different dolls. Peel's report, submitted to the SPR in 1967, is careful not to draw conclusions beyond what the evidence supports. He notes the pattern, he documents the phenomena, he lists the consistent physical characteristics. He presents the testimonies, assessed for reliability, noting where independent corroboration was possible and where it was not. But in his private correspondence, letters to a colleague at Cambridge, recovered after Peel's death and published in a 1999 anthology of paranormal research documents, he is less restrained. "I have spent 3 years trying to find the rational explanation for this," he wrote in 1966. "I have looked for the fraud, the shared delusion, the cultural transmission of a folk narrative. I cannot find them. What I find instead is this: there is a doll, or there are dolls, that appear to have been made with deliberate intent to attach themselves to families. That move without mechanical explanation. That appear in photographs from which they were absent. That produce in their owners a specific, consistent constellation of experience, the cold, the displacement, the dreams, the compulsion, the gradual erosion of ordinary certainty. That cannot be accounted for by coincidence or suggestion alone. I do not know what they are. I do not know who made them, or why, or what animates them, if anything does, in any literal sense. I know only this: something is happening with these dolls. Something has been happening for a very long time, and I do not believe it is finished." Arthur Peel died in 1971 without completing his planned 2nd volume of research. His notes, his interviews, and his physical evidence were archived at the SPR Library in London, where they remained largely untouched until 1987, when a paranormal researcher named Daniel Harwick discovered them and began the work of tracing the dolls that Peel had documented. Harwick updated the case files. He located 3 of the 9 dolls Peel had identified. He located 6 additional dolls with the same profile. He established, for the first time, a direct physical connection between dolls in different cases, a connection that Peel had suspected but had not had the technological means to confirm. The hair was the key. In 1989, Harwick submitted hair samples from 3 of the dolls he had physically accessed for modern DNA analysis. All 3 samples were a match. The hair on 3 different dolls, in 3 different households, in 3 different countries, was from the same person. The person could not be identified. The age of the hair samples was consistent with them having been cut from a living person in the late 19th century. That person would be, at minimum, approximately 110 years old. Harwick published his findings in 1991 in a privately circulated research paper that was reviewed by 12 peers. 9 of them responded, 6 found the methodology sound and the conclusions alarming. 2 were skeptical but acknowledged they could not identify the specific flaw in the evidence. 1 refused to comment. Harwick continued his research until 2003. He stopped in 2003 because that was when he held Mara for 40 seconds in a farmhouse in Lancashire and said, "It feels like holding a sleeping child." He died in 2004, and the investigation passed to Angela Morse. Angela Morse was 34 years old when she inherited Daniel Harwick's files. She had not expected to inherit them. She had been Harwick's research assistant for 2 years before his death, a position she had taken out of academic curiosity, as a postgraduate student in folklore and cultural anthropology at the University of Manchester, half convinced that what Harwick was investigating was a sophisticated and durable piece of folk mythology rather than anything with a physical basis. She had been wrong about that. She knew she had been wrong the first time she went with Harwick to see one of the dolls. She did not touch it. She stood across the room from it and she felt the thing that Harwick had described, that every witness had described, the warmth, the sense of recent occupation, the feeling of eyes that were following you with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be in all the time in the world. She did not write about that in her published research. She was a scientist. She wrote about the physical evidence and the testimonial record and the statistical probability of the pattern arising by chance. She wrote carefully and rigorously and with every tool of academic discipline she possessed. But she felt it every time. It was Morse who made the dark discovery. In 2006, while cataloging the contents of Harwick's files, she found a folder she had not seen before. It had been filed at the back of one of the archive boxes, behind a set of administrative documents relating to Harwick's SPR membership. The kind of place you put something you want to keep but do not want to look at. The folder contained a single document, 11 pages, handwritten, in Harwick's handwriting, dated March 2003, 2 months before his death, 1 month before he had held Mara. It was headed, Origin Hypothesis. Morse read it twice before she understood what she was reading. Then she sat for a very long time without doing anything. Then she read it again. Harwick's hypothesis, developed from 17 years of research, from the DNA evidence, from the physical analysis, from the testimonial record across dozens of families and 60 years, was this. The dolls were not haunted, or rather, they were not haunted in any conventional sense, not vessels accidentally infused with residual energy, not objects that had absorbed the psychic imprint of trauma or grief. Those were the standard explanatory frameworks that paranormal researchers had applied to them, and Harwick had applied them too, for years, and they had never quite fit. What fit, Harwick had concluded, was something different. The dolls were made, deliberately, intentionally, purposefully made as vessels. Not toys, not objects, vessels, containers for something. Harwick did not speculate too freely about what, because he was a rigorous man and the evidence did not permit that level of speculation. But containers, built to a specific design, with specific materials, the bisque porcelain for the head and hands, the cloth body, and crucially, the hair. Human hair from a living donor, cut at a specific stage of life, incorporated into the object during manufacture in a way that Harwick believed was not incidental or decorative. The hair is not ornamentation, he wrote. The hair is functional. Whatever is in these dolls, whatever animates them, whatever produces the phenomena, the hair is how it connects. The hair is the anchor. He had identified, in the course of his research, a manufacturer, not a factory, not a commercial enterprise, a single craftsperson, operating in the late 19th century, whose work, untraceable in commercial catalogs because it had never been sold commercially, appeared to have produced at least 12 dolls, possibly more. The evidence was indirect and circumstantial, a design consistency across the dolls that went beyond what chance similarity could account for, a specific characteristic in the porcelain composition that suggested a single production source, and one document, a letter, discovered in a private collection in Vienna in 2001, written in French, dated 1891, that referred to a craftsperson described only as Le Fabricante, the maker, who worked in the border region between France and what was then Austria-Hungary, who was known among a specific and secretive clientele, and who produced objects of a very particular kind for purposes that the letter's author described. with evident unease. As purposes I will not commit to paper. La Fabricante, the maker, Harwick had spent 2 years trying to identify her. He had found fragments, a reference in a 1903 Austrian police record to a craftsperson in a village near the border who had been reported by neighbors for reasons the record described only as practices of an unwholesome character. A mention in the private diary of a Parisian collector of unusual objects, written in 1897, of the woman near Salzburg who makes the dolls that are not dolls. He had never found a name, but he had found something else. He had found a birth record. In the village that appeared in the police record, a small settlement that no longer existed, swallowed by a larger municipality sometime in the mid-20th century. There had been a girl born in 1882 named only as Mara. No family name was recorded. The birth record was annotated, in a different hand, at an uncertain later date, whereabouts unknown after 1891. Inquiries advised, she would have been 9 years old in 1891, the age consistent with the hair analysis. The hair on the dolls. Angela Morse put Harwick's 11 pages down on her desk. She looked at the wall. She thought about a craftsperson in a village near the Austrian border, making dolls in the 1890s for clients whose purposes could not be committed to paper. She thought about a 9-year-old girl named Mara, last seen in 1891. She thought about hair cut from a living child and worked into the fabric of an object designed to persist, to attach, to follow. She thought about what that child might have felt. She thought about whether that child was, in any meaningful sense, still feeling. She put the folder back in the box. She did not open it again for 3 years. In 2009, Mara reappeared. She had been unaccounted for since 2004, when Daniel Harwick's estate was liquidated and his physical research materials, including 3 dolls from his collection, had been distributed. 2 of the dolls had been absorbed into private collections. Mara had been donated, at the instruction of Harwick's solicitor following instructions left in his will, to a charity shop in Lancaster. The shop had no record of receiving her. In 2009, a family in Galway, Ireland, a couple in their 30s, Mark and Siobhan Rourke, with 2 young children, contacted the SPR through their website. They had acquired a doll at a house clearance. They described her appearance in detail. They described the phenomena. Angela Morse drove to Galway. She sat in the Rourke family's living room and looked at the doll on the mantelpiece, and the doll looked back at her with gray-green glass eyes, and Morse said, very quietly, "Hello, Mara." The Rourkes had been experiencing activity for 6 weeks. The movements, the cold, the dreams. Their eldest child, a boy of 8 named Kieran, had begun waking at 3 in the morning. He told his parents he could hear a girl singing, somewhere in the house. When they asked what the girl was singing, he said he couldn't make out the words, but it was a sad song, and the girl sounded very far away. Morse documented everything. She photographed the doll, took measurements, catalogued the phenomena as reported. She spoke at length to both Mark and Siobhan, separately, to ensure their accounts were independent. The accounts were identical in every detail. She asked to take Mara for analysis. Siobhan Rourke helped her wrap the doll in a cloth bag for transport. As they did so, Siobhan said, very quietly, as though she was afraid to say it louder, "She doesn't want to go." Morse asked what she meant. "I don't know exactly. I can feel it. That she doesn't want to leave. That she's angry about being moved." Morse took Mara anyway. In the car, driving south toward the ferry port, Morse kept her in the back seat in the cloth bag. Somewhere outside of Locre, the temperature in the car dropped sharply. Morse noted it, glanced in the rearview mirror. The cloth bag was moving. Not dramatically, a slow, rhythmic shift, the kind of movement that, if you were being rational, could be attributed to the car's movement on the road, to an uneven surface, to the bag settling. Morse was not being rational. She pulled over. She looked at the bag in the back seat. She could hear, faintly, and she documented this in her case notes, and she is the only witness to it, and she includes that caveat explicitly in her report. She could hear what sounded like a child's voice. Not words, not singing, something lower and more continuous, somewhere between humming and breathing. She drove on. She did not stop again until the ferry terminal. On the ferry, in her cabin, she placed the bag on the floor and sat and watched it for 3 hours. Nothing happened. In the morning, she arrived in Holyhead. She drove to Manchester. She locked Mara in the archive room of her research office, in a sealed container, documented with a timestamp photograph. 3 days later, she arrived at the office to begin the morning's work. The sealed container was in the center of the desk. It had not been there when she left. The seal was unbroken. Inside the container, exactly as she had placed her, was Mara. Except, in the timestamp photograph from 3 days earlier, Mara's hands, the small bisque porcelain hands, the fingers slightly curved, the pose that of a doll resting, were at her sides. In the container, on the desk, in the morning light of Angela Morse's office, Mara's hands were raised. Held up, at chest height, palms outward, the pose of a child asking to be picked up. Morse documented the repositioning. She photographed it. She wrote it up in her case notes with the same careful, controlled language she used for every observation. She noted the time. She noted the condition of the seal. She noted that there was no sign of entry into the room. Then she sat at her desk for a long time. She opened the Harwick folder. The one she had not opened in 3 years. She read the 11 pages again. She looked at the photograph of the birth record. The girl named Mara, born 1882, last seen 1891. She thought about a 9-year-old girl. She thought about what it meant to be put into something and to stay in it. For how long? Across how many families? How many houses? How many people who had felt, as Siobhan Rourke had felt, as Margaret Astor had felt, as every witness across 60 years of documented testimony had felt, observed. Never alone, always watched. She thought about what the girl might want. And then she heard it. The humming, in her locked office, in the morning, with no child present and no radio playing and no source she could identify. A child's voice, low and continuous. Very, very close. Morse stood up. She walked to the door. She opened it. The corridor was empty. She turned back into the room. Mara was on the desk, still in her container, still behind the unbroken seal. But the hands had moved again. They were no longer raised. They were pointing, directly at the Harwick folder, directly at the 11 pages, directly at the birth record of a girl with no family name, born in a village that no longer existed. Directly at the notation in a different hand, added at an uncertain date. Inquiries advised. Angela Morse picked up her phone. She called the one person she knew who had spent longer than anyone alive studying the dolls that were not dolls. A retired academic in Edinburgh, 78 years old, who had been Arthur Peel's research partner in 1963 and who had never, in all the decades since, spoken publicly about what she knew. The phone rang 6 times. When the woman picked up, Morse did not introduce herself. She simply said, "She wants something. She has always wanted something. I think she's been trying to show us what it is." There was a long silence on the line. Then the woman in Edinburgh said, very quietly, "I was wondering when you would call. I have been waiting. We need to talk about the maker. We need to talk about what she was making Mara for. And we need to talk about the others. The ones who are still looking." Next time on the Haunted Doll Files, Episode 2, she came back from the ashes. A family in rural Wales burns a doll they call Agnes on a bonfire in their back garden. They film it, they watch it burn to nothing. 3 days later, she is back on the kitchen table, unburned, undamaged, and pointing at the door of the room where the youngest child sleeps.